All right. So, a couple things before we get going. So, I've got those Canvas discussions were due last night. So, I'm gonna have my TAs kind of help me grade those. We'll try to get those done by the end of the week. So, at the end of the day, Friday, you should have an idea about what your total grade is in that Canvas discussion category. Right now, I have all of the categories on Canvas set to be lined up with the syllabus. So, I've kind of got this set. So, it's dropping your lowest module reading. The grade you see is currently also dropping your two lowest quiz scores, and it's dropping your four lowest in-class quizzes. Okay. So all of your grades, other than that Canvas discussion, will be kind of the grades that you have going into the final. Those Canvas discussions, like I said, should be done by the end of the week. You can then play around with that hypothetical grade tool. So that's just under the Files tab on Canvas. Had this up since the last exam, but you can plug in your grades in those categories. Those should all be final now. Plug in your midterm 1, midterm 2 exam, and then play around with hypothetical grades for the final, and it would show you what your grade in the class will be. Now, you can also put in your CL points. Those are not factored into your grade right now. Those will get added in at the end. So if you had a 98, you had 1.98. If you had an 89 and you had 1.05 CL points, that would be a 90.05. Right? So those will get added in at the end of the semester once final exam grades are in. I uploaded those yesterday. There's a little bit of lag sometimes when those leaders get the attendance recorded. So for this last week, so I'm gonna remind them again today. I'll get those re-uploaded on Friday because I put an announcement up and mentioned this last week, but there are additional CL sessions tonight, right? So it's the last one. So everyone, we're replacing the ones where the snowstorm happened. These are going to be those additional ones. So it's most of the rooms and times that usually exist. I think there's two that sometimes exist that aren't on here. Yeah, there's usually one at each of the other, but these are the ones that are available this week, right? Based on the CL leaders availability. So if you want to go tonight, last kind of chance to get, a little bit of extra credit from the CL session 0.15. So those are up there on that announcement on Canvas right here. Okay. Other than that, I updated a question on practice exam A. I flipped two of the numbers when I was typing them in. Regardless of the mistake, you could have still got the correct answer that was there, but just to have something that makes a little more sense in the context of the questions you would see on the final, I've updated that, and it was what, question 15. So if you want to re-download that, question 15 will look a little bit different, but you would solve it the same way. It really shouldn't change kind of the underlying concept of that question. I just wanted to make sure it's, kind of matching up with what you would see on the final. Okay. Other than that, today we're basically going to be doing just exam review. So I'll ask you guys for questions. We can kind of work through anything. Practice exam A, B. We can look at old quizzes. Before we do that, a couple things I want to mention about the final, and I'll put an announcement up probably on Monday of next week. I might even post one this Friday and one on Monday just to kind of make sure that all this you're seeing this. But we are going to be in biology. So I think the abbreviation is JH. Room 124. So that building is right over there. So make sure you can find that room before the day of the exam so you're not scrambling to find it. We start same time as class at 8 a.m. It goes till 10 a.m. So we have 2 hours. There'll be 30 multiple choice questions on the final. So it's weighted a little bit heavier. There's a few more questions, but you're going to have more time per question than the midterms if you figure it out that way. Okay. So same kind of things as that first two midterms, right? You'll kind of sit down. We'll get the exams handed out. All you can have is something to write with, a non-graphing calculator, right? If at any time I see your phone out during the exam, I will take your exam and give you a 0. Okay? So if me or the proctors see a phone out anytime, we're going to take your exam and give you a 0. Okay? If you want extra paper, you can write an exam, but there'll be blank paper just like the midterms. The procedure really is going to look very similar to our in-class midterms. Okay? Also, make sure you bring some kind of a student ID so that when you turn your exam in, verify it's you. Looks like the two midterms. I think other than that, that should take care of kind of all the housekeeping and the logistics of going into that exam. Any other questions for me before we dive into just kind of doing review today? Now's the last time to ask them before the final. Okay. I also will put up my announcement about it has the logistics of the exam. I will have office hours is scheduled usually on Monday of next week, so 9:30 to 12:30. Obviously, we won't have office hours Wednesday because we'll be taking the exam. But if you do have last minute questions, that Monday, kind of office hours usual, I'm guessing it'll be a little bit busy. Probably the earlier you get there, the less busy it will be. But other than that, we can kind of get going here. Anybody have any questions that they want to see starting out? Yeah. All right. So practice exam B. So we'll look at 9 here. So we've got a perfectly competitive firm. Price is 70. We want to know what long run profits and the average variable costs are. So hopefully this is a relatively easy one in terms of when we're thinking about long run profits for a perfectly competitive market, what should they always be? 0. It's perfectly competitive. We see firms compete on price until there are profits, economic profits equal to 0. Excuse me. They can't lower the price anymore. Otherwise, they're going to now have negative profits. Okay. So the long run outcome should be we end up where? Well, with a perfectly competitive firm, we know that they have to take the prices given. So the point that would result in 0 profits let's see, there we go. What do I want here? Saves. Why is it not giving me the edit? Well, hopefully we can kind of, hopefully we can see this. It's a little bit light. It's not going to change it. Anyways, so here's kind of my price, right? What would happen is in the long run, in order for profits to be equal to 0, and this is going to be an equation that you need to have kind of on the exam, you have to have this burned into your mind. It doesn't matter what type of market we're looking at. What is our profit equation? If we stay open, it's what? Got to have this down. The quantity we're selling times how much are we making on each unit, whatever price we're charging, minus whatever our average cost per unit is. Okay. So if I'm producing something, what's the only way that profits are equal to 0? If price is equal to average total costs. Now, how does every firm choose the profit maximizing quantity? Everyone should say this in unison. How does a firm choose the profit maximizing quantity? The more responses I get here today, the more questions we'll get through. Where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Okay. So if we're thinking about the depiction we have, anytime this marginal revenue, so they take the prices given in a perfectly competitive firm, that price is their marginal revenue. So if it was up here, we're now hitting marginal cost at a point that's above average total cost, profits are positive. If we're down here, it's hitting at a point that's below, they'd be negative. The point where marginal revenue hits marginal cost and average total cost for these perfectly competitive firms will always be at that minimum point of our average total cost. So in the long run, these perfectly competitive firms end up at that minimum point of our average total cost curve. We also call this the what quantity? Starts with an E, efficient scale, right? It's the quantity that results in total surplus being maximized for the market. This is what we compare monopolies to competitive firms to. This will be kind of our long run outcome. So profits are equal to 0 in the long run. What's going to be true about my average variable cost? So the depiction we have here, I know has to be the short run. Why? In the short run, what do we have that we don't have in the long run? Fixed costs. Why do I know there's fixed costs here? Total costs are my variable costs plus fixed costs. My average total and my average variable cost curves aren't the same here. So there must be some fixed costs. So if this was the short run, right, we could think about there is in the long run, what is my average variable cost curve? In the long run, I've eliminated fixed costs. So all of my costs are variable. So average total would be average variable. They're the exact same thing. So if I know that I'm at this point where profits are equal to 0, that minimum point of my average total cost curve, that's also going to be in the long run my average variable cost. So in the long run, that price is equal to 60. That's equal to both my average total and my average variable cost here. So 0 profits, average variable cost is 60, that minimum point of my average total cost curve. So one thing I would kind of be able to kind of think about in terms of a depiction, and you could be asked questions on this even without the visual, but every firm we're looking at, we've got the same cost structure, right? We've got this marginal cost. It hits average total at its minimum point, okay? In the long run, my average total are my average variable costs. Also, I have to take that equilibrium price as given. That becomes the firm's marginal revenue curve in a perfectly competitive market. So we set that quantity in the long run where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. What is the marginal revenue of the firm? Whatever that equilibrium price is. Profits are 0, so we know that price is equal to average total costs. We've eliminated fixed costs, so that's equal to average variable costs. And in the long run, we get to this minimum point of our average total cost curve. In the long run, for perfectly competitive markets, everything is equal, right? Marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, is equal to price, is equal to average total, average variable, minimum point of our average total cost curve, okay? Any questions on that idea? Now, add in one thing where I could change the question. So maybe I ask you a question, which of the following is true? And I have like, is price equal to or greater than average total cost? Well, in the long run, everything's equal. It's a little bit easy, right? What if instead I'm in the short run, right? So if instead I'm in the short run, well, for any firm I ask you about, what should always be true? If they're profit maximizing, what two things always need to be equal to each other? This is going to be a rough exam. Marginal revenue is always equal to marginal cost when we're maximizing profits, okay? Now, in this scenario, what could be true in the short run? Well, profits don't have to be 0. So the price could be down here, in which case that price is the firm's marginal revenue. So what will also be true in the short run is price is also equal to marginal revenue and marginal cost for a perfectly competitive firm. Now, what's not necessarily true in the short run is I can end up at a quantity where that price, marginal revenue, marginal cost, it could be above or below my average total costs, right? And in fact, it could be above or below my average variable costs, right? So in the short run, this kind of part isn't necessarily true, right? Now, there is one caveat I could add on here in the short run, which lets you know a little bit more about these relationships. So if I'm in the short run and I have negative profits, but I stay open, what else could I make a kind of statement about? So if I stay open, but I've got negative profits. So negative profits would mean that price has to be what? Less than my average total. So I would know that's true. If they stay open, though, what also has to be true? That price is above average variable. So I can make statements about that relationship in the short run as long as I gave you like that they're staying open. Now, if they shut down, what do I know is true? Not only is price below average total, but price would also have to be below average variable. And then, not as interesting, if I have positive profits, what other statement could I make? Price would have to be above my average total. And if it's above my average total, what is it also going to be greater than? My average variable, okay? So these are kind of like our different scenarios. We could ask questions about the long run or the short run for these 3 different scenarios. Short run profits of 0, negative profits where they stay open, or negative profits where they shut down, okay? Excuse me. Any other questions on that before we keep moving here? I know I answered more than just the question, but these are things I think might be important to know, okay? And I have the exams printed, so I might have an idea about what's important to know, okay? Any other questions on this before we keep moving? All right. Any other questions people want to see work through here? Go here and then over there.
First tab B, number 22.
All right. So come down here. Yeah. So we've got these games. All right. And here, when we have these decision trees, this is where we've got firms making what we call kind of sequential decisions. So firm one goes first. They have two strategy choices. They can set the quantity of 30 or 40. Okay. We then have firm two making the decision second. So they see what firm one does, and they get to make their production decision. So here we've got the same strategy choices. They can produce a higher or a lower quantity. I'm just putting numbers to this here. And then we would write down here the resulting payoffs. Let me see if I have a marker that's a little bit more. There we go. So this was kind of our setup. We said with these games, we'll use backward induction. So we solve first for what firm two is going to do. So I would even use my hand on the exam like I'm about to do. If firm one sets a low quantity, what should firm two do? Well, the payoffs are always written in kind of a similar sequential order. So the payoffs on the left are for firm one, okay? So firm one's payoffs are here, firm's two payoffs are here. So what should firm two do? If they set a high quantity, they get 400, low quantity, they get 350. Which of those is better? 400, okay? So we've determined what firm two should do if firm one chooses this quantity of 30. So we know firm two will never do this. Now, if instead firm one chooses a high quantity, what should firm two do? 300 is greater than 250. So they'll choose 30. We know they'll never make this choice, right? So here's kind of the two best responses of firm two. Now, knowing this, we then say, okay, what will firm one choose to do? Well, they know if they produce a high quantity, firm two will always respond with a low quantity and they'll get 400. If they produce a low quantity, firm one will always produce a high quantity and they get payoffs of 300. Which of those is greater for firm one? 400. So our Nash equilibrium will be where we have two circles kind of in the same, decision, part of the same branch of the decision tree. So our equilibrium would be firm one sets a quantity of 40, firm two sets a quantity of 30. Okay. Any questions on that? Kind of how we go about solving those? Excuse me. Okay. And I'll kind of keep it, the exam, kind of similar, two players, two decisions. Okay. And then we had a question over here. 228. Yeah. So we then come down to 28. Yeah, so these are going to be a little bit tougher. Let me make sure. Yeah, so this is a good one to kind of review. So I give you, let's assume they're profit maximizing a quantity of 20. I tell you their marginal revenue and marginal cost. I tell you their average total, average variable, and the price they charged. So I think 27 is a little bit easier because that price is above my average variable cost, but below average total. If it's below average total, I know my profits are negative. But if it's above average variable, I should stay open, right? So if we're thinking about this, right, my profit equation is the quantity I'm selling times the difference between price and average total costs, right? If I stay open, we had a quantity of 10. Now, in this example, let me see, I think we had, what was the price? 38. And my average total cost was 58. So I know profits are going to be negative. So I might think, okay, I plug everything in here. I've got what? Profits of negative 200. That's the answer I go with. That's not correct, right? Because if profits are negative, what's the next thing I need to check? Do I shut down? If I shut down, the only reason I would do that is if price is below my average variable costs, right? So here my price was 38. I think the problem told you average variable cost was 45. So I should shut down. If I shut down, what are my profits? Well, I'm not making any money, but what do I still have to pay in the short run? My fixed costs. So my profits would be negative fixed costs. Now we can go through the step by step. Ultimately, you just have to worry about the end result. So fixed cost would be the difference between quantity and average fixed, or sorry, not the difference. It would be the quantity we're producing times the average fixed. What is my average fixed though? That's the difference between my average total and average variable. I didn't tell you average fixed in this example, so you would have to determine what that is. But if you know that the average total is 58, you know the average variable is 45. Well, that difference between the two is your average fixed costs. So here I've got what? 13, and I can use that quantity of 10. Now, here I kind of forgot something, which is right. My profits are always negative if I shut down, right? And so here I'd end up with what? Negative 130. So because I shut down, my profits, when I calculate them, I will not use this profit equation that we use in every other scenario, because this is only my profit equation if I stay open. If I shut down, my profits are negative fixed costs. We would kind of solve for them in this way. I could ask you a very similar question, not just for a monopolistically competitive market or firm, but for a perfectly competitive firm. They kind of go through that same decision. You'll kind of notice there's similar questions on some of the practice exams for perfectly competitive or monopolistic competitive firms in this kind of this like style of a question, because we would go about solving them the same way. Okay. Now you'll notice this should always, if you wanted to, you don't have to make both these calculations, but it can be a good check, because if I shut down, what are my profits? Negative 130. If I stayed open, what were they? Negative 200. Which of those is better? Well, losing 130 is better than losing 200. So we should have shut down. Okay. Any other questions on this one? Okay. Now, a good kind of check on this, this is where multiple choice, just some test taking techniques. In both 27 and 28, I gave you a price that was below average total cost. So right away, whether you stay open or shut down, if price is below average total cost, my profit should be negative. So I could have ruled out A and B in 27 and D in 28 right away. Right? I should be able to rule those out right away, because price is below average total. I know profits will be negative. Okay. Any other questions people want to see? $15 on B. Yeah, so this is a good one to review. So with our monopoly models, sometimes we can have these unique examples that we kind of said were natural monopolies. So I had kind of a depiction here. I've got marginal cost, hits average total at its minimum point. Here's the overall demand in the market that the monopolist faces, and here's their twice as steep marginal revenue curve. So we said one way to regulate this market is to set a price ceiling, right? The monopolist relative to a perfectly competitive firm, and we could kind of draw these out and compare, but I think this is an intuitive result. Who has more market power, a monopolist or a perfectly competitive firm? Monopolist. So what are they going to be able to get away with? Setting a higher price. So we know we want the price to be lower, because where is total surplus maximized? With a perfectly competitive market. So if we start to lower this price, we might come up here and say, well, what does marginal cost represent? Our supply curve. Right? We got one firm, their marginal cost would represent all of supply. So where would a perfectly competitive market end up at, where supply is equal to demand? So I might think, okay, I want to lower this price all the way down to 40. The problem is, if I do that, what's true about price relative to my average total cost? So if the price here is 40, the point that I'm at on my demand curve, I am below average total costs. So my profits would be negative what will the firm do in the long run? Can't hemorrhage money forever. So if your profits are negative, you exit. There's only one firm here. This is a monopolist. So if they exit, what are we left with? Nothing. We lose the entire market. We have not minimized deadweight loss by setting it at the price of 40. We've maximized it, right? We lost the entire market. So what can we do? What's the furthest we can push this monopolist to? When profits would be equal to 0, right? At that point, they'd be indifferent, right? So in theory, in theory, that answers the question. In practice, we're probably going to set it like just a little bit above that, just in case, because if they're indifferent, they could stay, they could leave, right? But we're talking about the theoretical point where they would still choose to they'd be indifferent about staying in the market. We could lower their profits to 0, which if I start to lower the price from 60, the last price that I could have them charge would be that point on the demand curve where it equals average total cost. So if you're thinking about these types of questions, maybe a good rule to write down is the lowest possible price I could set is where that demand curve hits my average total cost. And it could hit it at 2 points. So technically, right, it's where it hits it at, this lower point where demand hits average total cost. Okay. So that would be here a price of 50. So if that was the price we set, price is equal to average total cost, profits would be 0. The firm remains. Now, what would deadweight loss be here? So if I didn't regulate this market, and I won't get this perfect, but I'll try to kind of. So this isn't perfect, but you can kind of, right? If I didn't regulate it, the monopolist chooses a quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Oh, there we go. So they then go up to the demand curve to set the price. So relative to that perfectly competitive point where supply would be equal to demand, all of those units from 20 to 30, we're not seeing produced by the monopolist. So what is total surplus in a market? It's the difference between the marginal benefits in the market, which are represented by the demand curve, the marginal costs in the market, which usually is represented by supply, but here we have one firm, so we've got a nice, easy kind of marginal cost curve already. That difference between demand and the firm's marginal cost, all these units the monopolist isn't producing, that would be our deadweight loss of a single price monopolist. So that single price monopolist, and there might be a question on this exam, I forget. Oh, yeah, right here, 13, right? So if I had a single price monopolist, what would my deadweight loss be? So the height of this triangle is what? 40. The width is 10. So 40 times 10 is 400. But that's not my answer. Anytime I'm calculating deadweight loss in the context of the examples that we looked at, we always have a triangle. So we need to multiply by 0.5 or 1/2. So that would be a deadweight loss of 200, right? 400 times 0.5. Any questions on that before I keep moving? Give me one. I'm going to add something in here to kind of, and then we'll move on. So no questions on that part. Now, if I did regulate this price, right, what happens to my deadweight loss? Well, now I've lowered that price to 50. The profits of the firm are 0. If I did ask you to calculate deadweight loss here at this regulatory price, what would my deadweight loss be? Well, I can't calculate the value. I'd have to give you more grid lines here. But right, it would be that difference between demand and supply at this new lower price that I regulated it to, times the difference between, 25 and 30. I would see here, this is a much smaller triangle. So I've reduced deadweight loss by setting this lower kind of regulatory price. Any questions on this problem before we keep moving? So you had a question on 14 on this exam?
Yes.
Yeah, so if I wanted to look at consumer surplus and what's going to happen to consumer surplus relative to the allocative efficient point. So allocative efficient is just a fancy word that we kind of use to say, where does the perfectly competitive market end up? So here, if I'm thinking about, maybe it's easier to kind of draw these out, and then I'll kind of point it out where we're at on that actual depiction. So actually, let me stack these. And this is getting kind of light, so I'll do green here. Maybe. There we go. So I'm going to put these side by side. So here's my perfectly competitive. Here's my monopoly market. Right? So I've got my demand curve. I've got my supply or marginal cost curve. Okay. So the perfectly competitive market will end up at this point where supply is equal to demand. That will also determine the price. What is consumer surplus, right? So consumer surplus, anytime we're looking at surplus, it's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs. What are the marginal benefits to consumers? The demand curve, what's their cost? The price, right? So when you buy something, what's the cost to you as a consumer? The price you pay. So here I'm thinking about consumer surplus, and we said this goes back to like midterm 2 stuff. It's always that triangle on top or the area on top. So here is my kind of consumer surplus with a perfectly competitive market. What would producer surplus be? Well, same thing, difference between the marginal cost and marginal benefits now to producers. Their marginal benefit is the price that they're selling the good for, and their marginal costs, kind of represented by the supply curve or whatever we're given their marginal costs on. So producer surplus would be the area below the price, but above that marginal cost. So this is total surplus broken down into both consumer and producer surplus in a perfectly competitive market. Once again, this is like module 5, 6 stuff. Now, if we had a monopolist, what do? They make a decision to set the quantity where marginal revenue, this twice as steep as demand curve, is equal to marginal cost. They then go up to the demand curve to set the price. Now, before we think about what area represents consumer and producer surplus, the second part of that question should have been a little bit easier. With a monopolist, we have a firm with market power. We said they can get away with charging a higher price. Who is that a good thing for? So producer surplus is going to go up. Who is that a bad thing for? Consumers. Consumer surplus should be now lower. Okay, so we know that second part should be just from intuition that it decreases, but we can have a visual to show us that. So what is consumer surplus? The difference between demand, but now this higher price that consumers have to pay because we have a single price monopolist. And then what is producer surplus? The area below price, but above their marginal cost. So here's our producer surplus with a monopolist. Okay. So we lost a little bit of producer surplus here, but they gained this like larger rectangle relative to if it was say allocated, efficient, or a perfectly competitive market. So we see producer surplus is higher, consumer surplus is lower. What have we created? Anytime we move away from that perfectly competitive point, what are we going to have? A loss of surplus, right? We're no longer seeing these units being produced. We've created deadweight loss. So on the exam, I could ask you to calculate deadweight loss from a monopolist, single price monopolist, consumer, or producer surplus. So if we go back to our visual, where would these, or what would these values be? So I'll get rid of this here. Well, we already said, I kind of jumped the gun earlier. We calculated deadweight loss. What would consumer surplus be? Well, marginal revenue, it's marginal cost at a quantity of 20. They go up to the demand curve to set the price. So consumer surplus is the area below demand, but above that new higher price of 60. So what? 40 times 20 times a half. So that'd be what? 800. So 400 would be our consumer surplus here. So I think here we're asked about what is consumer surplus. It would be 400. And then we said relative to the allocated efficient point, we know that's going to be lower. Now we could convince ourselves of this because what would consumer surplus be if we were at the allocated efficient point or where supply represented by marginal cost hits demand? We'd be out here. So consumer surplus would be this larger triangle. So what? 60 times 30 times a half or 900. So, sorry, what is it? 60 times 30. Yeah, 900, right? So we went from 900 to 400. Sure enough, consumer surplus went down. Now, what if I asked you to calculate producer surplus? Well, that's the area below the price, but above our marginal cost. Well, I couldn't actually ask you in this problem because I gave you kind of this tail of marginal cost. But, maybe I did something like, I had like a constant marginal cost curve. Then what you would have, so let's say I gave you some values like this. I don't know. So let's say we had 80 here. We could tell that this was 60, and then this down here was 20. Well, then I could calculate producer surplus because it's going to be the area of this triangle. So what? 40. We'll put a hypothetical value here of 10. So 40 times 10 times a half. That'd be part of producer surplus plus the area of this rectangle. So what? 80 minus 60 is 20 times 10. So we would add these up. I get what? 200 plus 200 or 400 here. Okay. So you could be asked to calculate producer, consumer surplus, or deadweight loss with a single price monopolist. Okay. Any questions on anything there? So I know I'm trying to answer these questions along the way, but sprinkle in things that I could also ask you. Okay. Just to kind of test our understanding since we're here. If I gave you this problem, and let's just ignore for a second that the average total cost is there. We'll just ignore that because it might lead to like profits being negative. Let's say I gave you just the demand, the marginal revenue, and the marginal cost curve. If instead I had a price discriminating monopolist, what would be true about deadweight loss? Yeah, so if I have a price discriminating monopolist, this is where I'll draw some things out. I think people kind of get sometimes a little bit tripped up by this. So when we had a perfectly competitive market, our marginal revenue was just whatever that equilibrium price was. So it was this like horizontal curve. If I had a single price monopolist, their marginal revenue was kind of twice as steep as demand. If instead we have a price discriminating monopolist, when we look at the demand curve, they don't face a twice as steep marginal revenue. That twice as steep marginal revenue curve, we got to go all the way back. I showed you the equations and said if we set a single price, this is why our marginal revenue curve is twice as steep. I'm not going to make you reproduce that. I just said you need to know it's twice as steep. If I can price discriminate, though, I don't set a single price. I charge consumers exactly how much they're willing to pay. So what becomes my marginal revenue curve? Demand, right? So what will be true, if I think about marginal cost here, which would kind of, you can think of represents supply. Where would their marginal revenue hit marginal cost? It's actually at the same point as supply is equal to demand. So this price discriminating monopolist will actually choose the same quantity as a perfectly competitive market. Well, what is maximized with a perfectly competitive market? Total surplus. So if we get to that quantity, we've maximized total surplus, deadweight loss is 0. Right? So with these price discriminating monopolists, deadweight loss is 0. Now, if I asked you here, what is consumer surplus? What is consumer surplus? If I price discriminate, I charge every consumer exactly how much they're willing to pay. Consumer surplus, the difference between the demand curve and the price they pay, they're the exact same thing. I would end up with 0. They can extract all of consumer surplus. What does producer surplus become? Well, now the price they're setting is not a single price. It's every point here on the demand curve. We know there's no deadweight loss, so this is going to be total surplus. But if consumer surplus is 0, all of total surplus is going to be producer surplus. So the price discriminating monopolist maximizes total surplus, but all of it is producer surplus. Okay. So these are kind of the differences in the marginal revenue curves from these 3 different types of markets: perfectly competitive, single price monopolists, and then price discriminating. Okay. Any other questions on that concept before we keep moving here? Any other questions people want to see worked through? We're good? Ready for the exam? Yeah. Yeah, so we have these types of questions that we can solve for monopoly models. Um, we can also solve them for these duopoly models that we looked at when we were thinking about game theory. So here I've got price, quantity, and revenue. Right? Now, what I could do on the exam, if I left off this revenue column, how could you reproduce it? What is total revenue? Simply the price times quantity. So I could just take 100 times 0, 95 times 100, 90 times 200, et cetera, right? So if I'm thinking about these duopoly models, this first one is, let's assume they work together, right? They have this collusion agreement. They say, we're going to work together as a monopolist. Okay? Well, if I work together as a monopolist with the other firm, we're going to set the price. How does a monopolist set the price? How does any firm set the price? Where marginal revenue is equal to marginal costs. I'm told they have a constant marginal cost of 60. So what else do I need to find that profit maximizing quantity? My marginal revenue. So if I was on the exam, I'd write a column right next to this. How do I find marginal revenue? Once again, this is where the exam is not cumulative. So I'm still getting emails asking me about this. I feel like I've said this a few times. It's not cumulative, but we're using old concepts, right? So how do I find marginal revenue? It's the change in total revenue divided by a change in the number of units I'm producing, or quantity. So here, 9,500, our quantities are jumps of 100. So what? 95. Change in total revenue, what? 8,500 divided by change in quantity of 100 is 85. Now here's where that question 15 that had an error in it, I wouldn't give you values where these are going to be different jumps. So if we have linear demand curves, what should always be true? Every time quantity goes up by 100 here, price is going down by what? 5. If the marginal revenue curve is twice as steep, every jump of 100 in quantity, the marginal revenue should fall by 10. It's twice as steep. So notice if I go through, I can make this calculation. But once I get those first two and I see that it's dropping by 10, which makes sense, right? If demand was going down by 5 for every quantity increase of 100, marginal revenue is twice as steep, it should be going down by 10. So once I calculate these first two values, should be relatively easy to then fill in. Did I skip one? No. The rest of that column, right? It would just be that every quantity jump of 100, and I'll keep the quantity changes consistent, right? In all the examples you've seen, I've done this. So we now have our marginal revenue at each quantity. So where would my marginal revenue hit my marginal cost? Ooh, I've got a tricky one here. Because do I see 60 in that column? No. So we will produce up to the point where marginal revenue is greater than or equal to. So we know the last one we would stop at is if we did have an equal point. But if we don't, we say, okay, will I produce those first 100 units? Marginal revenue of 95 is greater than 60, so yes. Next 100, 85 is greater than 60, so yes, yes, yes. No, right? 55 is less than 60, so I won't produce that 500, I won't make that jump from 400 to 500. The last unit I would produce would be that quantity of 400. Okay. Any questions on that before I keep moving with this problem? Okay. So that's the quantity that these two firms would set if they work together. Now, once we find that quantity, visually, if we have this drawn out, we go up to the demand curve. But what is the demand curve? Well, I told you this is a demand schedule, right? Because what is demand? It's the different combinations of price and quantity that consumers are willing to pay. So I have price and quantity here. So once I find that quantity, going up to the demand curve is simply looking at what's the corresponding price, right? So they would set a price of 80 and the total quantity in the market would be 400. Now, when we have these duopoly models, if we have duopoly, two firms, it will never give you one with more than two firms. Like theoretically, I mean, I could, but I'll make it easier, right? I'm only ever give you a two-firm example here. If the total quantity in the market is 400, how much is each firm producing? 200, right? Half of that. Right? They've worked together to act as a monopolist. They want the total quantity in the market to be 400. Each one would produce half of that. If each firm produces 200, the total quantity in the market is 400. So make sure you're reading these. I bolded this. You say, what is each firm going to do? All right. So they'll both set the price at 80, but they're only going to produce 200 units apiece. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? So I'll throw in some additional things here. And I don't think it pops up on this exam, but I think on practice exam A it did, and this could be maybe the quiz questions. So if I had them work together, what is going to be true about the point that I'm at on my demand curve? Will it be elastic, inelastic, or unit elastic? So we said the demand curve is elastic if marginal revenue is ever positive. Usually this type of a question wouldn't be with a duopoly. It would be more like back with the monopoly questions, but it's the same concept. We have two firms acting like a single price monopolist. So if I ever had an example where I asked you about the elasticity of the demand curve, what you would need to look at is the sign of that marginal revenue. At that profit maximizing quantity of 400 for the two firms, marginal revenue is positive. So we know that we're on the elastic portion of the demand curve. Might be a good thing to write down. Okay. Now, let's assume instead we had a perfectly competitive firm. Their marginal costs are 60. Now, in 18, why am I talking about a perfectly competitive firm? I still have a duopoly model, but now I say they break this agreement, right? Because even if we agreed together, if I undercut your price, I was driving here today, and there was a gas station, Jesus, $4.99 for a gallon of gas. And then like literally half a mile down the road, it was $4.79. What do you think everyone's going to do today? Go to that other gas station, right? There's always going to be, if we're setting the price today at the same time, which is gas stations set them in the morning, it's always better to undercut the other person's price. But every firm has that incentive. So even maybe over the course of the day, what is every firm going to do? Lower the price until they have zero profit, right? As low as they possibly can to where they're still kind of earning zero economic profits. So we know that there's this incentive for each firm to break the agreement. So if they do, we end up at this perfectly competitive point, which is simply where supply is equal to demand. What represents supply? Marginal cost. I gave you an easier assumption here, which is that you have a constant marginal cost of 60. So what would I do? I'd be saying, okay, where on this demand curve, the different combinations of price and quantity would hit, marginal cost of 60 hit the demand curve? Looks like it would be right here at a quantity of 800. So if they break this agreement, end up with this perfectly competitive outcome, the total quantity in the market would be 800. The price would be 60. But how much would each firm produce? Well, if the total quantity in the market is 800, we have two firms. Each firm would produce 400 units, right? So down here, we have that price of 60 being set, but they're each going to produce 400 units, right? If they break the agreement. If they break the agreement, we just kind of end up in this price war where we end up at this perfectly competitive outcome. Now I could add in here, and this is where it won't always be the case. So when you're working through these practice problems, sometimes there's a lot of similarities. Sometimes things could change, right? The concept won't, but just because you see the answer be the same on the practice exam, it could be different, right? So in this example, at that price, what is true about the elasticity of my demand curve? Marginal revenue, if this was a single price monopolist, is still positive. So demand is still elastic. It doesn't always have to be the truth that the perfectly competitive market would end up on the inelastic portion of the demand curve. It could be. So let's say I had some different numbers and the price ends up being down here for the perfectly competitive market where they break the agreement. Well, now marginal revenue is negative. I would know that I'm on the inelastic portion. Marginal revenue is negative, inelastic portion of the demand curve. If it's ever positive, elastic. So it doesn't always have to be elastic or inelastic at these points, right? You need to actually look at the marginal revenue. Okay. For the perfectly competitive market. For the monopolist, Well, marginal revenue is going to hit marginal cost always at a positive value, right? As long as marginal cost is above zero. So we know the monopolist, single price monopolist, will always end up on the elastic portion. We don't know that about a perfectly competitive firm. Now, what would we also not know this about? So what other type of market would end up at the perfectly competitive quantity? We already talked about it earlier. We didn't have a single price monopolist, but a price discriminating monopolist. You'd end up at that same price and quantity as the perfectly competitive market did. Okay. Any other questions on that one before we keep on? Right. Any other questions people want to see work through? Someone's, oh yeah.
Question. Five. You get this part. Five.
For what?
For this one.
For 18?
Yeah.
So if they break the agreement, we end up with a perfectly competitive outcome. The perfectly competitive or equilibrium will be where supply is equal to demand. What is supply? My marginal cost. So I've got this constant marginal cost of 60. Where does it hit my demand curve? Would be wherever that price is equal to marginal cost of 60. That corresponding quantity is 800. Now, if this was a duopoly model or question, which it is here, I know the total quantity market is 800, but if I have two firms, each firm is producing half of them. Yep. Any other questions on this? Okay, I have another one before we kind of move to any other questions, just kind of for the sake of time. I want to make sure we look at this. And there were some questions on the quiz, but I'll draw one out that I think might be helpful. Wink, wink, right? So let's say I was looking at a monopolistically competitive market, right? So I give you a depiction that looks like this. So I've got my marginal costs, hits average total cost at its minimum point. This is where I should probably bring rulers, but it would take more time than it's worth. So, where does a monopolistically competitive market maximize profits? The quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal costs, right? So it looks very similar to a single price monopolist. The difference is we said they only face a portion of demand. Right? So they make a similar decision that once they have that quantity, they go up to the demand curve to then set their price. Now, in the long run, right, this doesn't have to be the case in the short run, just like for perfectly competitive markets. But in the long run, we said firms, if there's positive profits, firms are going to do what? Some firms are going to enter that market, meaning that all firms are going to have a smaller portion of demand pushing profits down. If there was ever negative short-run profits, eventually some firms are going to exit the market. Every existing firm, the remaining firms, would have an increase in demand, increasing profits until they're equal to zero. So I have an example here where the price they set is exactly equal to average total costs. So my profits are zero. This would be like a long-run depiction of a monopolistic competitive firm. Okay. Now, if I wanted to calculate deadweight loss, what I would do is compare this to what point? Well, where is total surplus always maximized? What does marginal cost represent? Supply. Where is total surplus maximized? In a perfectly competitive market where supply is equal to demand. So if I'm calculating deadweight loss, it looks very similar to when we were doing this for a monopoly, a single price monopolist. Now, here's where it gets a little bit different, right? So if this was kind of our perfectly competitive kind of quantity, if we're looking at the cost structure of a firm, it gets a little bit more nuanced, and we didn't dive into like the deeper or the next level of concept here. So where we're going to leave it at is if I want to find deadweight loss, I just compare to that quantity where marginal cost or supply is equal to demand. Now we talked about two other things with a monopolistic competitive market. The first is, what is the markup? So we said the markup is going to be the difference between the price they set and the marginal cost. Now, for a perfectly competitive firm, what's the markup always going to be? We said in the long run or the short run, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, but for a perfectly competitive firm, marginal revenue is simply the price. So markup would always be zero in a perfectly competitive firm. Price is always equal to marginal cost. With a monopolistic competitive firm, that's not the case, right? Their price is going to be set above marginal revenue and marginal cost. Now, if I wanted to then find excess capacity, it's a little bit different. And in some of the models I gave you in the practice problems or the quizzes, these were the same point. But that doesn't have to necessarily be the case. So I could give you examples from like the short run. There, it's easier to give depictions where these two quantities would be the same, but they don't always have to be. So excess capacity is going to be the efficient scale of production, right? Which this is going to be the quantity that minimizes average total cost. So the difference between that and what the monopolistic competitive market chooses, or firm chooses, I should say, is excess capacity. So I wouldn't be comparing to this quantity here. So let's say, just to put some hypothetical values to it, the excess capacity would not be 10. That would be what I use to calculate deadweight loss, but the actual efficient scale of production would be where marginal cost hits average total cost, because that is where that minimum point of the average total cost curve is, or that would be the efficient scale of production. Okay. So that quantity, let's say it was 25, my excess capacity here would be, instead of 10, 15. So when I'm determining excess capacity, it's not the difference between where that demand is equal to the supply curve. It would be where the difference between that monopolistic competitive quantity and the lowest cost point of my minimum, the minimum point of my average total cost curve, what quantity would that be? And the reason why, I said we didn't dive into it, but the reason why those two quantities aren't going to be the same is because in a monopolistic competitive market, we don't have a horizontal marginal revenue, we have a downward slope. Right? So that's why those 2 points might not end up being the same when we look at that efficient scale of production versus kind of where that perfectly competitive firm would choose. Okay? Is that clear what I'm saying here? Any questions on that? So in some of the questions, these quantities will end up like I could depict them being the same. That might not be the case. Right? It doesn't have to be the case if I was asking you a question like this on the exam. And I think there was one in the quiz that looked similar to that. Say it again. Yeah, we go back to model 9. What has to be true about every firm's cost structure? Marginal cost hits the minimum, or average total cost is the minimum. Any other questions on this before we keep moving here? Any other questions people want to see? We're good? Now's the time to ask questions. Yeah. Oh. Okay. Yeah. So let's take a look here. So 14. So we took a look at this earlier, but if we're thinking about, we could draw this out, which I think I had a drawing earlier, but I'll kind of try to walk you through intuition that would help with these. And, drawing these models out is ideal and the best way to make sure you're getting the correct answer, because some of our results are counterintuitive. Here's kind of a nice one where our intuition could go a long way. So we'll just talk through it and then I'll kind of draw it very quickly. So if I have a price discriminating monopolist, right, you can actually think about this as they actually have more power than a single price monopolist, right? Because they can identify exactly how much each consumer is willing to pay. So if they have a little bit more market power, right, what's going to be true about producer surplus? Well, is market power a good or a bad thing for firms? You want to be in Kelly, having more market power, a good or a bad thing for firms? Good. So what's going to happen in producer surplus? It's going to be higher if I can price discriminate. Now, if I can, so we should know, hopefully, that producer surplus is going to be higher. That wasn't one of the options here. We're just kind of thinking through this. Now, if I have a perfectly priced discriminating monopolist, I'm charging consumers exactly how much they're willing to pay. So if you were willing to pay $100 and you're charged $100, what is like the net gain to you? I value this thing at 100, paid 100 for it. My net gain is, if you could sell something for $100 and you paid 100 for it, your net gain is 0, right? It's your cost and your benefit are the exact same value. Your net benefit there, you can think about consumer surplus is really like the net benefit to consumers. The difference between how much I value from this good minus how much I paid. If those are the same, my surplus is 0. So if I can perfectly price discriminate, every consumer is going to have a surplus of 0. I add that up across all consumers, consumer surplus would always be 0. Okay. So we know that these price monopolists are going to decrease consumer surplus down to 0 and increase producer surplus. So the reason why these other ones are true, if we want to compare this to a kind of single price monopolist, we said, here's my single price monopolist. Right? They face the entire demand curve, twice as steep marginal revenue. Here's their marginal cost. They set the quantity. So this is my single price monopolist, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. They then go up to the demand curve to set the price. Okay. So what do we end up with? Well, where would the perfectly competitive market end up at? Well, marginal cost represents supply. So the perfectly competitive market would end up out here. That's where total surplus is maximized. So because they restrict quantity, all of these units, we lose that surplus. So this would be deadweight loss from a single price monopoly. If instead they can price discriminate, what did I say earlier becomes their marginal revenue curve? So this was the marginal revenue curve of a single price monopolist. If they can price discriminate, their marginal revenue curve is demand, right? They're charging each consumer exactly what their marginal benefit is. So where is the marginal revenue going to hit the marginal cost curve for a perfectly price discriminating monopolist? At that exact same point as a perfectly competitive market. So we said there, what is deadweight loss? 0. But the problem is, what is consumer surplus? Well, it's the difference between the price they pay and the demand curve. If I'm charging consumers exactly what they're willing to pay, it's almost like consumer surplus is this line. I mean, this gets a little bit into the weeds of mathematics, but if I like take a difference between two exact equations and I differentiate that, I'm always going to end up with 0, right? So, I mean, I shouldn't say different, integrate that. I don't always end up with 0, right? So consumer surplus is 0, which means all of total surplus is now going to go to who? I don't have the government in these models. There's producers and consumers. So if consumer surplus is 0, all of total surplus is producer surplus, right? So producer surplus becomes all of total surplus, or it's higher than a single price monopolist. So I think if we're looking at the context of that question, A said consumer surplus is 0, so that one's going to be true. Producer surplus is equal to total surplus. That's going to be true. Profit maximizing quantity is higher than a single price monopolist. That one's true. Deadweight loss is higher. Well, deadweight loss is actually went to 0. That's the one that's not true, which is what the question asked for. Okay. So being able to compare these price discriminating to single price monopolists is going to be something that you're expected to do, not only in terms of the quantity, but these surplus deadweight loss rates. questions. I guess if I compare this to a perfectly competitive market, what would be true about the price discriminating quantity relative to a perfectly competitive market? Is it higher or lower? Trick question. It's exactly the same, right? What is happening to deadweight loss comparing those two? Exactly the same. What's happening to consumer surplus? Well, consumer surplus is zero. Comparing it to any market, it's going down, right? And then if all of surplus is producer surplus, in every other example we had, we at least had some producer, some consumer surplus. So producer surplus of everything, it has to be higher than any other model. It has to be higher than these perfectly competitive models as well. Okay? Any questions on that before we keep moving? Any other questions people want to see here? I got time for like one more here, and then I've got a few more things to say before we get out of here. Yeah. A or B? A? Yeah, so we worked through one kind of similar to this before. So if I have two firms and they're agreeing to work like a monopolist, we said they're going to set the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Well, I gave you this constant marginal cost of 11. What do I need to then determine? Well, if I know I need to find where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, I need marginal revenue. Okay. So what would the marginal revenue be here? It's the change in total revenue divided by a change in quantity. Now, before we calculate these values, right, if price goes down by 1, what should marginal revenue be decreasing by? It's twice as steep. So instead of going down by 1, it would go down by 2. So if I do this, what's 57 divided by 3? So I have what? 19. What's this difference? So this is going to be what? 55. Wait, am I looking at this right? 55. No, hold on. 2. So 45. Sorry. 45 divided by 3. It's going to be what? 15. Sorry. Wait, am I doing math in my head correct here? 60. So 40. No, this is 55. Am I right here? Hold on. 43. 51. Sorry. 51 divided by 3 would be 17, right? That's what it should have been. I was making sure my math. So notice, once I find those first two, what's marginal revenue falling by? Not 1, but 2. I could go through and make all these calculations, but what's going to end up happening is these continuously fall by the same value of 2. Right? And once again, you want to go through here, you can calculate change in total revenue divided by change in quantity. We should see that it's always falling by the same value. So once I find those first two, I can fill in the rest of that column very quickly. So where does that marginal cost hit my marginal revenue curve? At a quantity of 15, right? Now, I set the price at 15, but if this is a duopoly model, the total quantity in the market is what we just found. So how much is each firm going to produce? 2 firms, they would produce half of that. So if the total quantity in the market is 15, right? We would see each firm is producing 7.5. So we don't divide the price by 2 because they're both setting the same price so that they equally split demand. Right? And then if they break this agreement, we had one earlier where we would go down, look at where that marginal cost hits my demand curve, right? So there I'm not looking at marginal revenue, I'm looking at the price that's associated with that demand curve. So in 22, they would set the quantity at 33. Once again, that's a total quantity in the market. So each one is producing half of that, or 16.5. Now, and then setting a price of 9. And that's where I said, here's an example where when they break the agreement, what's true about the elasticity of demand here? If marginal revenue is negative, then the demand would be inelastic. So we can kind of see that go either way. It depends on the sign of marginal revenue. Okay. All right. So think you'll want to listen and not head out of here very quickly or pack up. So I mentioned last week, I might have an additional in-class quiz today that could replace an additional one that you missed, right? So this won't necessarily hurt you if you weren't here today. I'll still drop your 4 lowest. If you fill this quiz out, then essentially this could replace one of your other quizzes, right? So it's essentially like I'm dropping 5 of your lowest if you were here today to fill this out, okay? So all this is, and take the next couple minutes, please try to think about this. And I'll set this so that we have a little bit of time as you're kind of heading out here. This should be on the main homepage now. It's just asking you questions, and I'm not going to look at any individual response. I just want to get kind of collective answers from this class as a whole. This helps me out. And I also think it's going to help you out to think about this a little bit more. So as you're leaving, kind of the next few minutes, there's no right or wrong answers. Just answer these next 7 questions, which are basically like, did you use AI in these different areas? Did you think that it helped your learning? Do you think that it hurt your learning? You know, try to be as kind of honest as possible. Also makes sure you're kind of honest with yourself. I think sometimes using these tools is fine, but like maybe looking back, you might say I relied on them a little bit too much, and I didn't actually learn the concepts better by using it leading into exams or quizzes. And I don't think there should be any code on it, so you should just be able to get right into it. Everyone getting into it okay? Okay. So as soon as you're done kind of answering those 7 questions, just hit submit. Once again, I had it set to be 9:20, so that should give you more than enough time if you're kind of taking the next few minutes to get it in. Other than that, once again, I'll put up an announcement with kind of the logistics that I mentioned about the exam at the beginning of class. I'll also have those office hours on Monday. There's those additional CL sessions tonight. Other than that, good luck kind of preparing for the final, and I will see you guys all on Wednesday of next week. Okay?